The Mandalorian Season 3 is finally over, and what a mediocre conclusion it was. Now look, I've been highly critical of this show since the very beginning, and I have received a lot of flack for being critical. Being critical of Star Wars gets you hate, being happy about Star Wars gets you hate, so there's no real winning with this fandom. You're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. But Star Wars as a product deserves a certain kind of quality within every fibre of the creative process. And as always, I try to see the good in things, and there were elements of this episode that I enjoyed very much. I thought the first 10 to 15 minutes were very entertaining, and I'd be a fool to try and tell you that the action set pieces weren't a lot of fun. But the substance of the show, the core of the show, is so empty. This season has felt like it's missed its soul, and this conclusion doesn't do anything to rectify that, and I was hopeful because I thought the penultimate episode was a lot of fun, and while it had its issues, I thought the setup could create a conclusion that was satisfying. However, this conclusion was everything but satisfying. It was rushed, it had all the big moments feeling undeserved, the plot structure was poor, the conclusion to the plot threading was poor, and when you can now view this season holistically, it doesn't really do anything to tie up any of the loose ends, or really play around with any of those themes or any of the narrative devices that were established earlier on. With that said though, the ending of this season does give an opportunity for the Mandalorian to reset and really put the focus back on the protagonists for Season 4. Now there are going to be spoilers in this review, so you have been warned. So the finale starts with one group of Mandalorians running out of the caves, and Din is being dragged into the Imperial facility by a bunch of Imperial remnant stormtroopers. Now of course, Din does what he does best, he lulls them into a false sense of security and he pounces and he attacks these two guards. I thought this action set piece between these three characters was a lot of fun, it was well shot, it was well choreographed, and it was entertaining, and that is one notable improvement over the past two episodes. The general cinematography, the general shooting of the episodes is a lot better. My only real criticism here is that I was under the impression that these soldiers had Beskar armor. I get that it's plot armor, but you have to remember that Din isn't covered with Beskar. He has a plate, a helmet, some gloves, but he has a lot of exposed spots in his body, and while he can take 50 million blaster shots and not feel a thing, these stormtroopers die in a couple of hits. And it feels like the Beskar doesn't really make them any more of a threat, but I could be misremembering that. But either way, one of the guards ends up restraining Din, and of course Grogu ends up appearing out of nowhere to save the day. And already here is my second criticism of the episode: the literal structure of the facility. We have to remember that in the previous episode, Grogu was split from Din pretty much at the entrance and was forced to leave, while Din was brought further into the facility. And somehow Grogu manages to make his way all the way into the facility without being spotted whatsoever while in a mech suit, despite Gideon actually having a tracker on both of them that he shows later. This is a nitpick, but when things are glaring like this, I think they need to be addressed. Anyway, the Mandalorians themselves end up using the interference between the surface and the atmosphere as a decoy to lure all of the TIE fighters and bombers away, and they basically sacrifice their capital ship, and while all of the Mandalorians come down, all of the TIE fighters go up unknowingly, thinking the Mandalorians had retreated to the fleet. Din then calls R5, who sneaks into the facility and hijacks a control panel, and Din walks up to the entrance of the command room that we saw in the previous episode. This room is guarded by a bunch of stormtroopers who are like in individual rows behind shields, so R5 shuts down each shield individually and allows Din to fight two stormtroopers at a time, and much like the sequence beforehand, I thought this was really entertaining too. It was creative, there was a variety of weapons being used, the actual fight and stunt choreography was fun to watch, and it was just a genuinely entertaining, enjoyable action set piece. And while this is happening, R5 gets detected by a bunch of mouse droids, and a load of mouse droids come swinging around the corner and they start like encircling him, and I thought this was funny to watch, but in the end R5 just uses his jet boosters and he flies out of the base, and at the same time Din manages to defeat the last row of stormtroopers. Now, as I mentioned, the first 15 minutes or so were really good fun. Up until this point I was having a great time. But then things start to go downhill as the story starts to take a bit more hold over the action, because Din walks into some kind of room where there's loads of vats, and these vats are full of clones of Moff Gideon. Now this was the core intent for the villain. We had all of this set up for the context of cloning, and while Gideon hasn't been particularly present in the season as a whole, it was all kind of leading to this, Force-sensitive cloning. And with that plot thread, do you think they're going to do something with these clones? But no, Din literally presses one button and blows them all up, and that's the end of that. So what really was the point of all of this setup? It all led to this utterly pointless moment. There could have been some nuance here. Perhaps Grogu could have interacted with one of the clones through the Force. Perhaps one of the clones could have attacked our heroes. They could have literally done anything and showcased why they were such a threat. But no. One button, all destroyed, total waste of time. We then switch back to the Mandalorians, who have now regrouped, and they're in some kind of cave that has a lot of growing life and fauna. And this is quite a poignant moment for Bo-Katan, who hasn't really seen this before. Most Mandalorians only knew this kind of habitat within the domes that they lived in because originally Mandalore was very inhospitable, and now it's growing life again. And this takes Bo back a little bit, and I think this reinforces her hope. They then decide to make one big final push on the Imperial base now that the TIE fighters are fighting the capital ship, and remember, it only takes one person to commandeer an entire capital ship. It's not like they usually need crews or anything. But anyway, they all fly back into the base, and we have this big dramatic collision between the stormtroopers and the Mandalorians. Bo-Katan ignites the Darksaber and flies forward like Superman, and there's this big battle in the air. Din then makes his way further into the facility, into the command center where Moff Gideon was talking to the other leaders, and then the other door, the exit, opens and Moff Gideon is standing there menacingly, basically saying how you destroyed all my clones, they were going to be perfect, and you've ruined my big plan, blah blah blah. And I'm just sitting here thinking to myself, why did you let him walk into that cloning room then, Moff Gideon? You had the tracker on them, and you didn't do a particularly good job at protecting your perfect plan. He could have protected his clones, but instead he stood out the exit for a dramatic introduction instead. But anyway, that wasn't my main issue here. As I mentioned earlier, the actual structure of the facility made no sense to me, and it just kind of gets worse here. The entrance to this command center from within the facility was guarded by these shields and these stormtroopers. It was a very dramatically protected entrance, and the actual command center itself is just one small circular room with two doors on either side. The door leading to the other side of the command room opens up, and it's this big sprawling open area where you could literally just fly in and walk into the command center. Again, a nitpick, but it's really, really stupid to me. Now look, I get the writing is difficult, it's not easy, and thinking about these things is the least of your worries when you're in the moment of trying to create something on paper. But surely someone looked at this moment and went, that's a bit stupid. Why is our command center heavily guarded from within the base, but not guarded at all from the exit that leads outside of the base? I don't know. Anyway, from here on, this is the core of the episode, the big final boss against Gideon. Now, he is in a mechanical Beskar suit, which is clearly leagues above Din's armor, and he is really struggling. Now again, the choreography, the action is good, it's fun, it's enjoyable to watch, and you can see that Gideon is in such a position of power here. He is like kind of playing with his prey. Anyway, the Praetorian guards that killed Paz Vizsla come walking out dramatically as they're fighting, and I love the little musical cue that plays as they walk out, and they enter the fight. It's now 4v1, and like they did to Paz, they overwhelm Din, and they're basically on the verge of killing him. But fortunately, Grogu walks out of the command center and starts spamming his buttons to get their attention, and with Din down, the Praetorian guards kind of take the bait, and they walk into the command center to try and get Grogu. All while this is happening, the big battle between the Mandalorians and the Sky Stormtroopers is happening just to the right of them in the air, and there were some really nice shots here of the battle. And there was one like third-person over-the-shoulder shot of Bo-Katan firing a missile, I think, and I thought that shot was really really, really good. However, there was some CGI here that just looked really kind of low budget. Again, typical Mandalorian lack of consistency. But Bo spots that Din was being subdued, so she flies down and she crashes into Gideon, and she ignites the Darksaber, and a battle between those two begins. Meanwhile, in the command center, Grogu has been removed from the IG mech suit, which was destroyed again, but he has got the high ground, and he's running on this little platform on the ceiling, and these Praetorian guards are just kind of standing there, swinging their sticks at him, but they eventually cut the platform down, and Grogu falls and gets trapped. But of course, Din then runs in before the Praetorian guards can capture or maybe even kill Grogu, and then we have a more in-depth fight scene between the Praetorians and Din. Again, very entertaining. The action is really, really good. The fight scenes in the episode holistically have been great to watch, and this was a really difficult fight for those Praetorian guards, because while they were attacking Din and trying to take him down as their focus, Grogu was kind of out of the way, just kind of force pushing them to stop them landing any real blows on him, and this was giving Din all of the openings he needed to shoot them with debilitating shots, and I thought this whole fight sequence was really, really well done. Anyway, outside, Gideon's getting the upper hand on Bo, as would be expected because of his armoured suit, and there's a little bit of dialogue here where he's, saying, "Are you gonna surrender or fight? I'll give you a warrior's death." And as Bo goes in for the swing, he grabs her hand and he literally crushes the Darksaber. And so I'm thinking to myself, okay, this is gonna be a good thematic moment, a prophetical moment, because it's been said that the Mythosaur is going to rise up and herald in a new age of Mandalore. And I thought to myself, this was a great opportunity for them to use the destruction of the Darksaber as a catalyst for this moment. A growing, thematically driven moment for the Mandalorians as a whole. They have been so attached to this weapon, a weapon that has been a symbol of destruction and war and unity, and it was time to let it go. And the Mythosaur, in terms of prophecy, was going to be the thing that was going to change everything and maybe be the deciding factor in this battle, because how awesome would that have been? But no, they literally just fly the destroyed capital ship into the facility, it blows up, a bit of fire kills Gideon, and that was it. Grogu then uses the Force, just like Kanan, because remember there's absolutely no creativity in the show, to essentially create a Force bubble around Bo and Din to stop them getting consumed by the same fire, and the story's climax comes to an end just like that. And I'm sorry, what was the point of all of the foreshadowing and all of the foreboding of the Mythosaur? Because you had all of the pieces in place to have the triumphant return of this iconic monster that only existed in legends and stories, this iconic monster that was prophesized and foreboded to be the grand return of the Mandalorians, and do absolutely nothing with it. And that is essentially it. The villains were virtually pointless. The entire villainous subplot was irrelevant. Now, the only way I can see them rectifying that is if they suggest that Gideon was actually a clone and the real Gideon was alive. That wouldn't surprise me because it was an easy thing to do. But there was no tension, there was no stakes, which is in stark contrast actually to all of the comments made by people who worked on the show who said that this ending was going to be painful or whatnot, because literally nothing happened. There was no twist, there was no moment of shock, there was no moment of epicness, there was no growth, there was no utilizing of the foreshadowing or the themes that they had established in previous episodes. It was literally devoid of anything but mindless action. God, this season has done nothing but frustrate me, and this was pure frustration, because we then end up in the living waters again, now everything's settled down, and Din essentially says, you know what, I want Grogu to be my adopted son and no longer a foundling. So the armourer then basically renames him as Din Grogu, which is very odd, because surely it should have been Grogu Jaren, but whatever, I can't be bothered to argue against the logic of this show anymore. And then, to make things even more frustrating, there's this small little shot where Grogu kind of looks over the waters, and I thought, maybe they're going to do something with the Mythosaur here. Maybe its nose is going to pop out, and maybe Grogu's going to connect with the Mythosaur. But instead, they have this stupid little cutaway shot that is the exact same shot earlier in the season, just the water's a bit bluer, and the Mythosaur just opens its eyes and looks at the camera. Very creative, guys. I'm glad you did anything with any of the foreshadowing all season. It was brilliant. Then, the armorer basically just tells Din to piss off and go and do adventures with Grogu again. I kid you not, she literally tells Din to leave and have adventures with his son. So Din does just that. He flies to the New Republic base we saw a few episodes ago, with that X-Wing pilot who always just kind of shows up, and says, yeah, I'm ready to be a bounty hunter again, but I'm going to be a good bounty hunter this time, and I want to work on a case-by-case basis for the New Republic. Meanwhile, back on Mandalore, the Mandalorians have restarted the Great Forge, and they're all cheering for Mandalore, and then we whiplash over again to Navarro, and Din stops in and says hi and gives Greef Karga a fully rebuilt IG-11 just like that. It's not like we needed a whole episode at the beginning of this season to say that rebuilding him was impossible because his memory core was screwed, but it's fine because they found a disconnected IG droid head in the bar of that Republic base or whatnot, and so, you know, it's happened, he's back, no context, no nothing, it's fine, don't question it. And then the season ends with Din going into a little cabin that Greef gave him, and he's just kind of sitting there chilling while Grogu is playing with a frog, and then the season ends. Now remember, at Star Wars Celebration recently, they said that The Mandalorian is no longer a show about Din Djarin, it is about the Mandalorians. Okay, cool, so why does The Mandalorian season finale set up a separate storyline where the Mandalorian and Grogu are doing adventures for the New Republic while the Mandalorians are rebuilding their homeworld? You forcibly put Grogu and the Mandalorian back together for no real reason so they can kind of just exist within this Mandalorians regaining Mandalore storyline, said that the Mandalorian now represents the Mandalorians as a culture and not as a character in regards to the show, and then split those storylines off again at the end of it. Make it make any sense. But with that said though, the good thing is that having those two stories separated does allow, potentially for season 4 and beyond, to actually focus on the story of the Mandalorian again and the story of Grogu, and to get back to the core narrative of these two characters. Because if you really think about it, the only thing we have achieved in regards to the growth of Din Djarin as a character is, nothing. The only development our two protagonists have this whole season is giving Grogu the name of Din. And to be honest, Din as a character has actually gone backwards in his progression as a character. There was so much setup for him to be this kind of reluctant hero, the reluctant leader of the Mandalorians moving forward. He was given the Darksaber, he was given that rivalry with Bo-Katan, and this season does everything to essentially backpedal upon that. And in regards to his character, where is the progression? Because we are pretty much at the exact same spot he was in season 1 and maybe the beginning of season 2. He's just chilling with Grogu, but instead of being a bounty hunter, he's a good bounty hunter because he has an official child now. And if you think about it, the whole plotline for Bo-Katan is also basically the same thing as Star Wars Rebels. It's literally just that retelling with an actual conclusion. I mean, sure, if you haven't seen Star Wars Rebels, this can feel fulfilling, and I get that, but if you have seen Star Wars Rebels, it's almost the exact same thing again. And so, by the end of it, you have a season where there was no stakes, there was no tension, there was no development for our main character, the main character that according to its creators is no longer the main character, a villain who was basically pointless and only showed up in the last 2 episodes to then not do anything, and just let our heroes ruin his plan and then die, supposedly. And for me, this season has just concluded in such an unsatisfying way. Now, I am not one of those people who wanted cameos. I saw a lot of people talking about how they wanted Luke Skywalker to save the day, or perhaps Boba Fett or Ahsoka Tano, blah blah blah, and I'm glad they didn't do anything like that. But I did want them to do something with the very theme of prophecy that they established. I wanted them to do something with the mythosaur that they had been foreshadowing all season. I wanted them to delve into Din's psychology, I wanted them to delve into his indoctrination into this cult-like group, and have more growth individually for our two protagonists, and for me, we didn't get that at all, because it felt more like a regression. And yeah, sure, we got the progression of the Mandalorians as a group, their story definitely did move forward, but I'm not watching this show for them. I'm watching this show for Din Djarin, the Mandalorian whose name is in the title, the protagonist. You don't just decide the title of the show no longer pertains to the protagonist of the show and then change the core focus of the show into something different. For me, it just dilutes what it's all about. If they really wanted to do that, they should have just renamed the show The Mandalorians and then marketed it as a show about the Mandalorian people rather than marketing the show as a sequel to Season 2. Or perhaps they could have literally just made a second show called The Mandalorians while keeping the focus of The Mandalorian on The Mandalorian. But ultimately, it all comes down to the Book of Boba Fett and them essentially ruining the plot's springboard and all of the emotional weight that came with it. But anyway, I have rambled on too long about this show. I'm just glad it's over. I don't usually give numbers to these things, but if I was to give this season a score, I would probably give it like a 3 or 4 out of 10. This is below average TV, and Star Wars deserves better. It was full of poor writing, a lack of exploration in its themes and its foreshadowing, poor execution of its major events, an unsatisfying conclusion, inconsistent CGI, inconsistent dialogue, inconsistent writing in general. This is just not a good season. If you were to take the rose-tinted lens of Star Wars off of this show and look at it for what it actually is, if this was just a sci-fi show, I guarantee you people would not care about it and people would see it in a very different way. I love Star Wars and I want Star Wars to be better than whatever this was. If you want to be in my comment section hating on me because I'm critical of something I love, good for you. If you enjoyed this show and you had a lot of fun with it, I'm not putting you down if you did. Good for you. I'm glad you could enjoy it where I couldn't. But I would have no integrity as a content creator and as a person if I didn't sit here and tell you exactly what I thought of it with honest conviction. If you enjoyed this extremely long-winded review, perhaps hit the like button, it helps me out a great deal. And with Jedi Survivor on the horizon, perhaps consider subscribing to join my community. I'll see you guys in the next video. But until then, may the Force be with you. Always.